Yingzhen, and I'm your humble moderator for this panel session. We have an amazing lineup. I'm sure many of you know one or even more papers from them. Yeah, can I just ask each of the panelists to introduce themselves briefly, talk about what's your research interest, what have you been working on with Approximate Inference?
Hi, yes, I'm Kevin Murphy. I'm at Google Research. I'm interested in structured probabilistic models and applications to computer vision and various forms of data analysis, time series analysis, and so on.
My name is Winther. I'm from the Technical University of Denmark and University of Copenhagen. Many years ago I worked a lot on Gaussian processes and EP and that sort of thing. Nowadays I like to play with variational autoencoders and also a lot on medical and bioinformatics applications.
I'm David Duvenaud from the University of Toronto and the Vector Institute. I also, many years ago, spent a long time working on Gaussian processes and worked on... Pardon? Okay, testing, great. I also worked on Gaussian processes long enough to become disillusioned by them. And I've been working more on variational inference and neural networks and learning to do inference in the last little while.
Hi, I'm Tamara Broderick. I'm at MIT. I guess I'm broadly interested in how do we help practitioners make decisions in the face of uncertainty. And so I think part of that is Bayesian inference, which provides this nice quantification of uncertainty and point estimates, and how do we do that sort of fast and in high dimensions. But I think it reaches more broadly than that. How do we deal with robustness? How do we deal with evaluation? How do we do all of these things fast? And I think sort of crucially, either with theoretical guarantees or with some way to evaluate after the fact.
And hi, I'm Alemi. I'm at Google, and I'm honored to be the least qualified member of the panel. But recently I've been investigating generalized information bottleneck sort of objectives and interpreting existing inference techniques in sort of information theoretical.
Cool. I'm going to start from the first question about the gap between theory and practice. So I think in this workshop we have seen some works that really wants to make the inference method correct. So we've seen improvement on unbiased gradient estimators. We've seen works from people trying to debias say rational inference methods. But these kind of nice theories might not actually translate to practice. We have some biased gradient estimators actually works better than unbiased gradient estimators. The jackknife version inference doesn't work that well in the training stage. So I just want to ask you, how you do comment on this, and can you share your experience on how can we make, say research that make the theory translate better to practice?
I guess one thing
Please go.
I was going to say, one thing I'll say is that I think the success of deep learning has softened people's views on boundless or bound-free research. So when I went on the job market and I was talking about hyperparameter optimization, people said, didn't you just optimize a non-convex function? Isn't that always a terrible idea? And I would say, well, I had to, and I did, and it worked. And people did not like that answer. But I think, as far as I understand, in the next couple of years, people started to say, maybe our intuitions about, how bad problems are that we can't prove are always solvable, like non-convex optimization, aren't strong enough for us to dismiss methods that don't have these guarantees, for better or for worse.
Yeah, so I want to say two things. One is that I think it's completely okay to spend a lot of your time on just studying theory, because we are now so many people in machine learning that there will definitely be a subset that will also take care of bringing whatever guys here, maybe in the room, who are more focused on theory, will find out. And the second thing is that I see, for example, with variational autoencoders, that we are not start using them, for example, for transcriptomics, for analysis of gene expression, and they work quite well. So I think it's not too hard to take these methods that we started out using on MNIST only and take them to some applied domains?
I guess I don't know. I don't see these as being in competition. I think that they are somehow helping each other. Like we can have totally heuristic methods that, as David was saying, perform really well, and that can help us drive theory. But conversely, I think we have to care about some type of knowing whether our methods work, especially in these cases where we really care about the outcomes in healthcare or cybersecurity or something where the decision that we're making really matters at the end of the day. But I think that there are different ways that we can do that, sort of getting a little bit at what I was mentioning earlier. One could be theoretical guarantees before the fact. Although there, I think we also have to think really carefully about what are these guarantees? Are they the thing that we really care about? Or are we getting at what we're really going to be reporting? But I think a totally valid alternative is to say, can we really evaluate that we've done well? So then it doesn't matter if you take a method that's entirely heuristic, as long as you can say, hey, this did work out or it didn't. And then, that's another totally valid way to think about it.
Again, the two Google people are suspiciously silent. That maybe rings alarm bells. Maybe I'm supposed to pontificate. I mean, I agree with what's been said. I don't think we need both sides of the equation, right? So I think heuristic success can inspire theoreticians to explain why things work when they shouldn't. On paper they shouldn't, right? Non-convex optimization in high-dimensional spaces, it's miraculous, right? So what's going on? And conversely, I think if we have theoretical breakthroughs, they often matter much more than like some efficient GPU encoding, right? Because you get orders of magnitude speed up if you have clever tricks like reparameterization or route blackholization or whatever. These are algorithmic fundamentals. So I think both are important.
And I think, we could. I'll put out a call to action, right? I sort of agree that rarely what we actually want are just samples from the posterior, right? We want to use those samples to actually do something. So maybe, our community needs like a good benchmark test where we can actually evaluate whether these approximate methods are achieving some task that we care about, and then push on that for a while, or for next year, and see what happens.
Yeah, I'd actually like to pick up on that point. I think, we're probably everyone in the room is a diehard Bayesian, right? But like the rest of it, the remaining 8,000 people, the unwashed masses, they don't care, right? They're not convinced for the most part that Bayes matters or probability matters. And so I think, outside of certain regimes like active learning and RL, well, not even so much RL, Bayesian optimization and bandits and so on, there aren't that many killer apps yet. So I think it would be interesting to think of more applications that are easy to test and show the benefits of posterior uncertainty.
Thanks for your answer. So my second question is about connections between like sampling methods and variational methods. So we resort to approximate inference basically because we cannot compute the integral efficiently. So that's basically previously we used variational methods, and in kind of like previous decades, variational inference, people work on variational inference, MCMC, people work on MCMC. But right now I've seen like these trends of these two fields emerging together. Today we've seen papers using variational inference to improve MCMC. We also see papers previously that use MCMC proposals, say, to build the Q-distribution of variational inference. So I wanted to hear from you guys the comments on like these merging trends between, say, sampling methods and variational inference.
So I'll just get in while I have something to say. But as a relative newcomer to the field, I think it's a really exciting time. The fact that there's such a convergence, like it feels like real progress is being made in the kinds of algorithms that we can do, and the kind of progress that we continue to make. So I find it really exciting.
I just want to say, it would seem so hopeless, like at the end of my PhD in like 2014, that the Bayesian non-parametrics methods would ever sort of impact what was going on in deep learning. And I remember talking to Shakir Mohammed, who should be here, who's not. When he went to DeepMind, he was saying, these deep nets are hard to beat. And then variational automotors were this like beautiful synthesis of latent variable models and neural networks. And I do think it's like been surprisingly harmonious.
I'll add something. Just to add a little perspective, so I was at a different conference earlier this week, and there's yet a third class of methods that I think is interesting, never comes up at, I think, these like NeurIPS associated conferences, but there's a whole class of methods based on Laplace approximations, so INLA, these integrated nested Laplace approximations, and I guess the point that I kind of want to make is that maybe it's worth thinking that these are not the only two options that we have. That MCMC and variational are nice, but that doesn't preclude that there are other options. And then certainly there is at least this third one that is extremely widely used in practice. And so it's just worth keeping our minds open to, you know, what are we trying to do and how do we get there?
Cool. So I'm going to open the Q&A session, and if you have any questions, you know, that you want to ask the panelists, please just, you know, raise your hand and we will reach out to you. And also this year we have a slightly different format. I asked the panelists to prepare questions that they want to ask for fellow panelists. Yes, so we are going to take turns. So if no one is going to start a question, then I'm going to hand it to one of the panelists. Maybe Kevin?
Here's one I prepared earlier. Well, so I think the name of the game is all about speed accuracy trade-offs, right? So Tamara had a nice plot of like error versus time, and I think for something like core sets, we sort of know how to navigate that curve in terms of the number of points that you sample. I think for Monte Carlo methods similarly. For variational methods, it's not so clear. It's maybe more discontinuous because you have different model families. But I'd like to see more of these kinds of trade-off plots and ways to characterize Pareto frontiers, because it's a lot of people talk about, oh, my method is faster, but like at what cost in terms of accuracy? So can we characterize those trade-off curves? So this is supposed to be a question for the panel or for?
Well, if you guys have comments, you can
anyone
also,
who wants to
yeah,
pontificate on that.
I just want to say, you saw my question, which was basically, yeah, how can we choose the model size? Because that's the one thing that Bayes' rule will always tell, like the marginal likelihood is always going to say, make your model bigger, right? And that's, well, okay, like add more parameters and integrate them out. It's not going to hurt an expectation. You know, add some more hierarchical structure, you'll pay like a few bits maybe in the worst case, but you'll potentially gain a huge number. Like make the model family larger, maybe a more precise way to say that. So the point is that we can't answer this question from within Bayes' rule.
Because you need other factors.
Yeah, and like Stuart Russell was writing about this in the 90s about how to do meta reasoning. Distinct from meta learning, right? Like he was trying to come up with principled ways that we could, choose which computations to do. But I think that whole enterprise kind of stalled, and now we're just left with stick it in an RNN and hope for the best. And I'm just wondering, does anyone have a plan? Because that's where I'd like to go, but I don't have any detailed plan based on beyond what the basics of what Stuart Russell did, basically.
So I can tell you what my hope is, right? I don't know if this program is going to succeed, but to answer, I guess, both your questions, my hope is that maybe, information theoretic objectives can help shed light on this. Like, give us a metric that we can measure that we can trade off against. And the principal trade-off I hope we could investigate is like, how much data, how much information in bits do I actually extract from a finite data set versus, how many bits are required to specify the complexity of my model class. And while it would be nice if you just build a better model, you always get better results, that's not what happens in practice, right? On a limited data regime, you can kind of overfit in limited data. And I mean, we'd like to think that Bayes fixes this, but it can also suffer from this problem. And so that's one way I think that we could tackle this fundamental trade-off. And I would like to imagine a world in which we could realize that dream, where you just build a bigger model, which is strictly a superset of a smaller one, and you can always just get better results in practice, even in the limited data regime.
I want to add to that in addressing, I think, Kevin's original point, because I think something that I totally agree with there is that we really need to think about metrics. Something I'd like to see more of is starting from a real data problem and then coming up with a metric based on that. So a lot of practitioners that I talk to, they're using Bayesian inference in order to report a point estimate and uncertainty. So this came up in my talk. And so I think that's a really natural metric to care about in certain cases. But there are other cases where that is maybe not the best metric. So for instance, I think in plenty of unsupervised learning problems, we don't really care about the Bayesian posterior. We care about finding some structure in our data, be that a topic, a set of topics, a set of clusters, something like that. And something that I think is worth keeping in mind with all these things too. So having a metric is, I think, a first step to thinking about these Pareto frontiers and so on. But I think something that's worth keeping in mind too is avoiding over-optimizing our metrics when they're not quite right. So I think, again, especially in unsupervised learning, I suspect that anything we had would be a rough metric. It wouldn't be the thing that we somehow really cared about. And so then when we over-optimize to these metrics, I think we end up maybe doing ourselves a disservice that we sort of put the metric above all else, instead of, I think, probably the thing that we should do is put that data analysis problem above all else. Like, what are we doing for the practitioner? What are we trying to do at the end of the day that actually matters to science, to engineering, to whatever it is we're interested in?
Cool. Any questions from the audience?
So there's been, we have now, I don't want to put a number of decades on it, but we have decades of really fantastic work in this area. When are we going to be done? Right? When is this? When are the tools we have to solve these approximate inference problems going to be sort of mature? For some definition.
I think when we have a combination of what we have now in terms of like automated systems that let people who have real data analysis problems work on their problems, or we have something that tells them that like they can't do it in the time that they want, and that's sort of like the Pareto analysis frontier, right? So something that does it if they can, and tells them that they can't otherwise. Like, I think that would be nice.
I think they're becoming mature. I mean, Stan, for example, is used so much, right? And I think also I have students who find out that Stan doesn't converge, so that's there's still work for you guys a few years and now. I think also that I mean, for example, the recent progress in model-based reinforcement learning. I think I also seen the papers that use original autoencoders. So I think we're making a lot of progress, and the day where all reinforcement learning are model-based with some latent space, then I think we're maybe getting towards AGI with Bayesian methods or whatever.
I mean, as soon as we get the current set of tools mature, we'll ask for harder problems, right? So it will stop, maybe inference in RN will be solved to some degree, and then we'll start looking at combinatorial spaces, program induction from small sample sizes with strong generalization, extrapolation the way that humans do. They see a few dots and they come up with all kinds of crazy theories, scientific theories, and some of them they test in an efficient way. And that's just kind of what we want to do, right? So we're far from that. I mean, general probabilistic programming in rich combinatorial exponentially large spaces that are unbounded a priori, this is all open stuff.
Thanks for the optimism.
And I play devil's advocate and extend that question. How do we know whether we make progress, let alone it's solved, right? So I mean, today in this talk we have, like in talks we've seen the standard way of measuring certain inference methods is to run hold-out-log like the analyst. So I mean, I'm guilty of this myself, right? But somehow other communities, speech, vision, NLP, they have established common task frameworks, right? Tasks with metrics, ways to make progress and disseminating progress in the community. If you come up with a new approximate inference method, how would you know whether it's better, right? I mean, we have seen great illustrative synthetic examples, which is great, but what is the real signal to the community when progress is?
I mean, I'm going to agree with you and say I don't think we have the answer to that right now, but I think we should, right? And I mean, maybe I'll throw an idea out there. What if we had a rich synthetic data set with tractable likelihoods? If we had such a data set, like let's say we trained the best generative model we can on images or audio, or like a rich data set, and it had convincing looking samples, And then we could generate synthetic data sets of arbitrary size and have access to true likelihoods. Now we could test, how close we achieve the true posterior, or at least in a Monte Carlo sense, get estimates of our actual errors. Right? And I think that might be a good place to start. I mean, I think now there are generative models that are rich enough that it won't be obvious that we're just overfitting to the model. I think we have a hard time doing good inference in the kinds of things that we can synthesize these days. And maybe that's the place to start. I don't know.
I just want to shout out to a DeepMind paper whose title I forget recently on video generation that did exactly what you proposed, which they made a synthetic data set where they could compute the bits per sample that the optimal model would be able to achieve, and then show that their model achieved that. And I think that would be a perfect example of what Sebastian was hoping for. I guess I would also say there's a lot of problems in discrete inference that would make great test cases, except that none of our methods really even begin to address them. Just, like induction and things like that. And there's a whole bunch of still toy discrete inference problems that aren't even really benchmarks because no one can really do much on them.
I'm just going to add on this point. So my previous training told me that when I want to evaluate the accuracy of a approximate inference methods, I wanted to compute some sort of divergences between the exact posterior and the approximate posterior I've got. But I was really struggled by, when I work on Bayesian neural networks, the mean field approximation works really well. So, in Bayesian neural networks, we are supposing to be in the multimodal cases, and this mean field approximation can only capture one. But it still works very well in the prediction time. So could you have some kind of ideas or kind of comments on these different evaluation methods, and what is exactly the right way to evaluate these approximate inference methods?
Oh, I guess I would disagree that mean field inference works well for Bayesian neural networks. Bayes by backprop just completely fails on any sort of interesting large network with mean field. And so there's just a few methods that sort of kind of work. But yeah, it's just not there for Bayesian neural networks, I'd say.
So I just speak. So there's a lot of work, being practical in economics done on uncertainty and decision in uncertainty. One being choquette capacity. There's also work being done to extend Bayesian theorem to pack settings, like pack Bayesian. Are there any convergence on this kind of less mentioned disciplines? So are there any work that's being done that looks into using choquette capacity and pack Bayesian analysis to deal with the Bayesian uncertainties?
Oh yeah, so I know Dan Roy has been doing a lot of great work on that. One thing I want to say is that I've seen people go on the job market and being criticized for not having bounds for their Bayesian methods, and I would say, every variational lower bound is a bound, but it's for that particular problem and for that data set, and for that particular set of assumptions, and that's even better than a general bound in some settings. But anyway, I think you know a lot more about this.
I have comments on the things you're saying, not on the original question. I guess, I don't know, the thing with the variational stuff is I feel like this is one case where everybody focuses on this one particular bound, and we treat the elbow like it's the thing that we ultimately care about. But I think, you go to a practitioner, you go to a physicist who's running their MCMC for 2 weeks, and you're going to say, I got this elbow value, and they're like, that doesn't matter for my physics, I really need something that's actually going to be useful for deciding whether or not, this was an exoplanet or something like that. And so, I don't know, this seems like one case where variational methods are extremely powerful. I think they're fantastic. But I think it's worth keeping in mind, what is the thing that we actually want from the practitioner's viewpoint? I think there are plenty of cases in economics where we really care about something like an uncertainty. I think there are plenty of cases in physics and chemistry and biology and all of these cases. And I would just like to understand more, I think, why are we getting the bounds that we are? Why are we getting the theory that we are? Why are we getting the, the metrics that we're using from the standpoint of the ultimate application?
Okay, and I guess I would push back on that and say you have double standards between MCMC and variational inference, where variational inference is at least giving you a number and saying, I'm doing at least this well. And sure, that might not be good enough for the physicist, but if you run a chain for a while and then give them some diagnostics, you also can't, say that you solved their problem with certainty.
So I totally agree with you that MCMC run for a finite amount of time is going to be an approximation as well, but I do think that we do have a number of useful diagnostics for MCMC, and I think that's being developed for variational Bayes right now, which I think is a really exciting area, and I'd like to see more of that, because again, I think it's not just about having theory. It's fine, I think, if you don't have theory, but then you want a diagnostic. You want something that's going to say, oh, you're doing so well. And I sort of don't care whether that comes from MCMC, from variational Bayes, from Laplace, from something else, but just something that tells me, oh, I'm getting close to whatever it is I care about.
So I would also love to have that, and I would say that the MCMC diagnostics we have don't do that because they can silently fail.
Yeah, fair enough, yeah. So better diagnostics for all methods would be awesome.
Right, but because of the Sharpie hardness of inference, we sort of know that we can never have such, such guarantees. So that's why, to me, I'm sort of satisfied with the lower bound.
But then this makes me wonder, are we already getting up against this Pareto frontier that Kevin was talking about? Is this just impossible? What can we hope to accomplish? I feel like the lower bound, when we know that things can go so poorly, that you can have this, like I was saying earlier in my talk, that you can have this this moderate or even quite small KL and get really arbitrarily far off in variance estimates and mean estimates. That seems scary if that's what I'm reporting, So is it just that it's hopeless, or, is there something that we can do?
Okay, we should probably stop this talking about that. But I would say, I agree that we should be on this Pareto front, but the elbow lets us measure, at least lower bound of where we are on that front.
Ooh, but I don't think it's the front that we care about in many cases. I think it's a proxy for that, and it's not necessarily the right proxy, is all we're getting at. I enjoyed this discussion.
So I just want to push back a little bit to suggest that it is a very useful front, minimizing KL, because of its relation to things like mutual information and information theoretic quantities, which I like and can't not be said. But then I just want to push back a little bit on suggesting that variational bounds aren't as useful in the scientific context as potentially MCMC, because honestly, I'm a former physicist, and the Feynman inequality, mean field, that term comes from physics, right? Because if you have an intractable system, in some sense, the only trick in condensed matter is you form a simpler system that has a tractable Hamiltonian partition function, and you use that to study properties of a much more complicated system. And the reason that works is exactly the same variational bound that we use in the elbow. And so it's sort of the one trick that has powered at least StatMech for 50 years.
So I want to say that my position was not that variational is bad and MCMC is good. It's more that we want to get close, I think, in many applications, in estimating means and variances, and I think we should understand the limitations of both methods in doing that. And I think the limitation for MCMC is really obvious, that you spend enough time and you're not necessarily equilibrating, and I think that at least sometimes it's easy to lose track of the same, or the symmetric limitation that exists for VB, which is that minimizing the KL may be really interesting if our goal is understanding some information theoretic property or something like that. But if our goal is something else, then I think we should understand the relationship between the KL and that goal. And I'm just pointing out that sometimes I think our goal is something else, and then we need to be aware of that connection.
Well, if I can bounce back on that, more than a mean and an uncertainty, maybe what we want instead is, a point estimate and, some notion of the variability of that point estimate. And the mean and the variance, they're not really great for that, right? If
Absolutely.
You've got a multimodal distribution, if you've got something with fat tails. So maybe actually it turns out that, the mean of for example, the Gaussian that minimizes the Kullback-Leibel divergence, that might be a good notion of a point estimate.
So I totally agree with you that the mean and the variance are not what we want in general. I think there are plenty of cases, as you said, multimodal cases, but also large tails, so we might care about quantiles instead of covariances. I think there are lots of reasons. But what I'd like us to do is to start up front by saying what is our goal, and then not move that goalpost, and then aim for that goal. And so whatever you want your goal to be, I definitely agree, it does not need to be mean and covariances. And I think in some cases it might be something totally different than what we're all talking about right now. But whatever that goal is, let's establish it from the perspective of an applied problem, and then aim towards that goal.
So it seems like a lot of themes that go on into this current panel discussion, I think in past years of this approximate inference panel discussion has been about evaluation and then driving this towards some application.
And in particular, for this specific audience, which tends to focus a lot on methodology, I was curious about how you guys tend to balance that level of abstraction of focusing on something that seems to be a good enough benchmark. It's not so targeted to a particular application that it's just so focused. And the other extreme, which is having these VE negative likelihoods on NDIS.
I don't know if it's an answer to your question, but I think I've been following also this community for a while, and I'm pretty optimistic. I think that kind of the conversation we have as a community has moved forward a lot. I mean, for example, this discussion about variance of estimators and our understanding of it has progressed a lot since last year, and I think also to make the methods useful, it's very important to understand this stuff. So I'm pretty optimistic about this. I think we can also run ImageNet if we don't want to kind of talk bad about ourselves that MNIST is too simple a benchmark. I think in a few years when our GPUs becomes a little bit faster, we'll all do ImageNet, and I think that's a pretty challenging task for generative model, and I think we will also use more, and we will also understand NLP more and do more NLP, and hopefully in 5 years it will not be BERT that will be the best encoder of text. It will be some kind of real generative model. I'm pretty confident about that, and that's something that comes out of this community. I don't know if that answered your question, sort of.
I guess also I'd just say that when I've seen people work on real problems, often their first step is to throw away 99% of the data one way or another. So I found that to be a pretty fruitful place to look for blind spots in our current modeling regimes, is where people just say, oh, well, I can't handle that, so I'm just going to erase it and then start from there.
So relating to applications, what would you all say is like favorite or most pressing application where Bayesian statistics ends up really mattering? And then sort of related to that, it's like dream application of Bayesian statistics. If you had infinite application, your sample works instantaneously for any model, or something you just love to apply it to.
Well, I think Kevin Murphy mentioned model-based RL, or was it that that's one place where we should be totally dominating. And I think Carl Rasmussen's Pilco demo from like 6 years ago still has this like amazing super model or data efficient demo that I think is absolutely astounding. And I think that could be like our big win potentially.
Maybe I should provoke a little bit. I think that when I do supervised learning in, for example, bioinformatics, I'm completely happy with our toolbox of convolutional neural networks, recurrent LSTMs, and so on, and that will stay on for a while. Maybe explanation methods is where you have a small data set and you really care about uncertainty, right? So, well, maybe now I just want to provoke maybe the audience a little bit.
I think something that comes up there too is, people talk about using these for these small data problems, but you can also have a relatively small amount of data if you have a very high dimensional problem, and so I think this comes up in a lot of these like modern biology applications, astronomy applications, and things like that. And that seems like some place where I tend to hear people saying, oh, I wish I could run Bayesian inference, but it was far too slow, and so I gave up. And it seems like we should be able to provide that.
Yeah, I guess I'd like to hope that, we all kind of think Bayesian inference works well in the small data limit. I guess I would like to believe, or I'd like to hope that we might be able to really kind of understand what's going on and use that to get much better performance out of existing models. Like, right now, somewhat depressingly, we're still in the phase where you build a bigger network on more GPUs, TPUs, what have you, you get better results in the sort of supervised set. And that, I don't know how long that trend will continue, but there's lots of direct and indirect evidence that we are suboptimal in training the much smaller networks, right? We really ought to be able to do a much better job at making predictions on a single GPU than we can today. And maybe, whether it's directly Bayesian or not, the lessons that we learn by pushing hard on Bayesian inference and approximate Bayesian inference, I would like to hope could help turn that one GPU model into looking a lot more like the 500 GPU model.
Yes.
So I have a general comment on that. So I like what you said before about having like some metric of information gain, or like information in the data that you have and the capacity of whatever model you're using. And so I'm just studying my PhD, and it seems to be that there's a lot of emphasis on exactly what you said. It's kind of huge GPU compute power, I don't know, thousands of dollars an hour or whatever, rather than the algorithmic contribution. And how do you have any opinion on how to benchmark that so as not to say, okay, we got this 21% improvement in whatever, and no report at the time, or something like that. What's your opinion on that?
Yeah, so well, certainly it's harder, right? Because if you're going to sell people a story where, if you're going to do some kind of compression, if you're going to limit, if you're going to bottleneck the performance of your model, it's going to do worse. But the interesting thing is, if you can phrase this thing as not just a single, like maybe another way to phrase it is instead of thinking about a single objective, it's time to start thinking about a one-dimensional family of objectives. And now you can trace out Pareto-optimal curves. And then, even if your results are worse, if they're only epsilon worse, but they're 10 times cheaper in terms of compute, or in terms of time, or in terms of size, number of parameters, checkpoint size, then people have to shut up and listen, right? So I think, but you're never going to win on a point estimate. I think the way you win on any point estimate is you throw more compute and time and human energy, thought at it. But you can win on pushing a curve in a certain region, and maybe that's one way to push back.
I just wanted to comment on what you said about large data and small data. So for like neural network models, you can show that they are singular model, like something like unidentifiable. So as n goes to infinity, some Japanese statisticians have actually shown this, that n goes to infinity, the posterior distribution doesn't really concentrate and become normal. Right? So it has some kind of weird shape. So I think it's really not about the data, but it's rather about the size of the model. So you have infinite solution, and it lies in some kind of weird valley, so it relates to robustness. And if you perturb your model, it might go into some direction that are really, really bad. So I think for the problems that we care about right now, somehow that one solution that SGD chooses is sort of seems to be working. But I'm sure that we need to worry about the neighborhood, also, because there are other problems where you can change the neural network and it will go really good. I think uncertainty is important in every case.
Yeah, maybe I can answer that very briefly. I think when people invented dropout and so on, that's exactly, maybe they didn't know about this manifold, but that's exactly to kind of confront that question. So I think that in the kind of, you can say, kind of penalized maximum likelihood setting that we use today on deep learning, it addresses some of this. I'm a little bit kind of, and it's kind of very pragmatic. Someone invents something and it works, and then we all start using it. I think the Bayesians are maybe more kind of principled, and that might not be the direct road to the goal of making the best possible inference in a deep learning model. But time will tell.
I'll just say one thing, and there's a backlog of questions. In terms of exciting applications, I think I'm interested in like online learning and lifelong learning. And like right now, there's a lot of, you have a fixed data set, you have finite vocabulary of labels, and it's a forced choice thing, right? And you get these sort of random decisions on ImageNet, like is that a poodle or a chihuahua? I don't know, right? And maybe it's neither of the above, right? It's actually, it's an elephant. And so there's a lot of recent results showing that these models are overconfident because they've only seen a small number of things. So as the data streams in, we're always in the small data regime because the world's always changing. And new animals come into existence, and certainly new products are invented, and new words, and whatever, new situations. You have to adapt. Sometimes you go see old stuff before you realize it's something familiar, and you should improve your estimate of something familiar. And then you have to sort of create new categories in your own mind. And it's, you're always on this non-stationary setting. So Bayes is, in principle, a great fit for this, but it's not very popular currently. But I think it will be.
Okay,
Okay, we have many questions, so Ulrich.
Okay, I want to ask a future question. So I really love Bayesian inference because you get posterior uncertainty, you get calibration for your models, you're robust to outliers, and then maybe in 5 years I'll sit in my self-driving car and it will be presented with a scenario that it's never seen before. What should we as a community do to ensure that real uncertainty, or approximate uncertainty, or predictive uncertainty actually make it into real applications? Because we have the tools to do this. And maybe it exists in real applications, I'm just not aware of it.
I think that's hard, right? So in order to get it to show up in self-driving cars, or it needs to not only work, but it needs to scale. And that's, I think, the reason why it's not used right now. That's we all know that Bayesian inference is optimal if you have the right model. But really getting it to scale and kind of be able to beat just an off-the-shelf CompNet with a point estimate, that's the real challenge, right? Now, I agree that part of that is convincing the world, like designing a better test, right? A test that really shows off the power of uncertainty, the killer app that Kevin was talking about. I think with such a thing, you could, turn some heads and start changing the conversation. But otherwise, it's a pretty uphill battle because you need to do more for less.
I just want to give a shout out to all the great software development that's been going on, and now we have off-the-shelf ADVI and Stan, right? Like that's just a huge night and day difference over even 3 years ago. I mean, I know Stan's been around for a while, but it wasn't as nice.
I'm just asking an outlier question. So we have 150 people here and the same amount on the waiting list, but we're less than 5% units. So I'm just thinking, how can we make the biggest impact? We already start to attract the RL people here, and I'm very happy to see bridging the gap from Bayesian inference to RL. But what other machine learning directions apart from application-driven ones? For example, I see a couple of different modalities. So how can we bridge the gap from Bayesian inference to other machine learning directions? How can we identify these common grounds that our technique can also benefit other machine learning directions?
I think this is an excellent question. Well, we need to make impacts to other views. So maybe you guys can talk about your experience. For example, David, you have these kinds of techniques incorporating ODEs, right? So how do you come up with this idea? How do you think this can help?
Well, this is a funny story. So number one, it was what I was saying before, don't throw away your data. So Yulia Duvenaud is a sort of biostat student, and we had this data that was about patient records that came in at irregular times, and she wanted to bin it, and just every month there would be a bunch of data for each person, or it would be gone. And even David Sontag's been doing this lately, where they just use these discrete time models and then just do imputation. And that just seems so tragic, right? It's actually really informative when someone comes into the hospital, right? That tells you a lot about their latent state. So I said, no, let's just do an ODE. I'm sure it'll be fine. And so from writing the autograd, so I didn't actually write most of the internals, but I wrote a lot of the vector Jacobian products, like the gradients. And the answer to every vector Jacobian product is to call the original function, but somehow transposed or reversed. And I knew it had to be something call an ODE but backwards. And then it turned out that it was already in Stan, but using forward mode. And then it was just a few weekends. And then it turned out it was all been done in the 60s. And I just didn't know it was sorry. That's the answer to that question. I kind of want to hear Sebastian's question.
We'll come back in a second. Okay, let's take another one.
So it's been said that posterior means or posterior variances are not very useful in several settings like multimodal heavy tail. But at the end, in MCMC, what we are trying to prove is some bounds on mixing time, which cares about the whole distribution. But I was really interested in the whole distribution. I was just interested in some Bayesian, and in such a case, what would be the good metric? What could be the good theoretical question to ask? Because when you look at the bounds for mixing time, it grows exponentially with dimension, and everybody's sad. But maybe we shouldn't be that sad. Maybe we are doing something good, but we are not measuring it directly. So
So do you think, is there something that could be useful in this sense?
I just want to say that whenever you try to formalize these notions of are we doing the right thing, I always end up just reinventing Bayesian decision theory, right? And same with measuring model, Andrew Gellman says you need to model and do model checks. Every time I've tried to come up with the principled automatic formulation of model checking, it just looks like making the model bigger and then evaluating marginal likelihood again. So that's where I feel like these roads are going to lead. It's just going to end up fitting bigger models.
Yeah, I like this perspective of, I mean, at the end of the day, we're often using these things to make decisions. And I think that's why we care about things like point estimates and uncertainties to make the best decisions. So just maybe to make this conversation a little bit concrete. So one application that I worked on a while back and we're sort of reviving right now is we have this method for letting people who can only sort of move a single muscle, like they might have locked-in syndrome or cerebral palsy, to write or draw or use a GUI. And their Bayesian inference is important exactly in this decision-making framework. The question is, did they choose this selection on the screen, whether it's a word or something you want to draw or pointing and clicking at something. And so there we actually do care about potentially multimodality if that's actually something that a user exhibits in their click times, maybe because it's so noisy. And then we care about it specifically for the ability to make a decision at the end about, did they with high probability choose this particular choice? And so I think there are a lot of other cases from, again, this decision-making perspective that will help us guide, what do we actually want to do at the end of the day? Usually it's make some kind of decision.
Did you get my question?
Yeah. So actually, observation on the panel. A few of you said something to the effect that, if you just want to train a continent, or if you just want to train a get a point estimate, right? The current toolbox is sufficient, and we are happy. So therefore, we need to search for where we with our techniques and so on to make the most difference. Always or simplification or something like that. But if you go back and read, David McKay's 1993 paper or something, right? It's inspirational, right? It says, neural networks, flexible model, right? We need estimation uncertainty. It's really crucial, right? And then if you look at the current models, every ImageNet model has between 20 to 30 million parameters. This is not an accident, right? And you have all these interpretations of SGT as Bayesian inference, dropout as Bayesian inference, conventional as Bayesian inference. So kind of, why not? Why can't we be on these benchmark tasks? Why can't we be in terms of predictive performance? Using the Bayesian toolbox should be possible, right? Refer me a little for other benchmarks. Why can't we do it for real benchmarks which really matter?
So I will say that me and Roger have a paper that is noisy natural gradient that does actually make BGG be a competitive, like Bayesian BGG be competitive in terms of predictive performance in calibration. Right? That's still not like the state of the art huge networks, but it's getting there.
But have we lost space? Well,
that's what we're doing.
I know, but did we give up on predictive performance?
I haven't lost faith. I'd like to believe that the Bayesian answer is the correct one. It's just when you've got that, when you've got Inception resonant V2 with those 30 million parameters, you can neither do kind of good enough MCMC to draw samples from the posterior, nor do we have the right variational posterior. I think noisy Atom and KFAC are a huge step in better posteriors for neural networks. I think but I think that's just why we're losing. It's just we've got crappy approximations on both ends. If those get better, then eventually you should win.
Well, and I guess I'd also say that we've been letting the deep learning crowd set the agenda in terms of these large data problems. And I think the history of the field would look very different if MNIST had only had like 500 examples or something like that. So people do just try low data experiments, but that's not what you were asking about. You were asking about on the largest data sets, how well can we do? And that's sort of the pathological situation where Bayesian methods would be least performant compared to point estimates.
I mean, if you have the right prior, I think we could do it.
Yeah, uncertainty, since the parameters are unidentifiable, being a little bit of Gaussian fuzz around the point estimate might not buy you anything, right? So maybe you need to be doing model averaging on ensembles, and if you do that, then you do win, right? So if you think of ensembles as just poor man's base, it's already winning. But I also agree in these large data settings. ImageNet, the classes are balanced, so there isn't much headroom there. I think if you could have rare classes or small data sets or non-stationary distributions, one-shot learning, all of these edge cases, which are really the most common cases in practice, Bayes should win maybe all of it.
Okay, so in the interest of time, I'm going to close this panel with one final question. So imagine that now you have, okay, maybe let you ask. Okay.
Are you sure? Okay. So one thing that, so a lot of emphasis has been placed on these posterior uncertainties that we can get from Bayes, but there's also one thing that was mentioned that you also get from Bayes, and that's a marginal likelihood that you can do model selection with. I think that's super cool, right? Because suddenly you don't need to do all this different architecture search, and it's differentiable, so you might even be able to do model selection using backprop, using this unified objective function. Is that not a big advantage that we could be looking into more as well?
I mean, I guess I'd just say if you have a medium-sized data set, at least cross-validation is just hard to beat, right? It's just so robust, and you sort of can't go wrong. You don't have to believe your model. So that's where that's fallen down for me in practice. It's just most of the benchmarks have a big enough data set that you can just do cross-validation.
If you let me liberally reinterpret your question a little bit. So another thing that we might try to do, or I'm worried about the ability to do model selection. We can't do model selection with large models today. But one thing that we might be able to do, and get the same kind of benefits, is like this is the Approximate Bayesian Inference workshop, and almost everybody here is doing Approximate Bayesian Inference. Maybe next year some people should try to do Approximate Bayesian Inference. And what is that? Well, I don't know, but in particular, I would like to see, the thing David said earlier, like if we really could make progress in achieving the dream, where if I just add another layer to a network, everything just gets better. It never gets worse. Because that isn't today. That is a form of model selection. If I just set that last layer to be affine, I should get the same performance that I got before I added it. And current approaches at Approximate Bayesian Inference sort of can't do that in the million parameter setting. But maybe there's some Approximate Bayesian form of inference that could.
Okay, so thanks for attending this amazing workshop. So please join me in thanking these panelists and also the organizers.
Just one final comment to conclude. Well, thank you to the panelists and the speakers, of course, and thank you to all of you for joining us today. Please stay tuned. We plan to organize the workshop again next year, so please stay tuned for news. And if you have any feedback that you would like us to incorporate and something we can improve, please send us an email. Thank you.